All right, grade 12 biology. This is your second video. This is the endocrine system. Just a little keep in mind up here, endo means inside and crine means to separate or to sift. So the endocrine system is the system that takes care of hormones, releasing stuff into your blood, checking your blood for various levels of things, that kind of stuff. So we're going to see the liver, the pancreas, and that kind of thing. Let's have a look at our learning goals. We're going to do the intro to the endocrine system. Why is it an important system? We'll talk about how do hormones send signals, the two different kinds of hormones, the protein hormones and the lipid hormones. We're going to talk about different glands and different hormones, some major glands and hormones. We're going to take a specific deeper dive into the pancreas and the sugar hormones and diabetes, and a deeper dive into reproductive hormones and hormonal birth control. So we're going to learn a little bit about how the birth control pill works. So to start with, let's talk about the importance of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system of glands and sensors that monitor the blood and the body for various parameters and release chemicals into the blood and the body to affect the body in response to that. So you might notice that I keep saying they affect the entire body. That's really the major advantage. The major advantage, I'm just updating the keep in mind, is that you can affect the whole body with one message. I hope that fits on the thing. Let's see. Oh, one chemical mess. Major advantage is affecting. There we go, that's easier. Major advantage is that is affecting the whole body with one chemical message. So you release one chemical, it'll go through the entire body, and then you can have different receptors respond differently to that message. So something might speed up in response to a hormone, and something else might slow down in response to a hormone. But it's the same hormone that gets released. So a good example of this is adrenaline will speed up the heart rate, but slow down the digestive system in order to give you more energy. We don't really think about it, but it's very, very important because the hormones circulate through the blood, and the blood is hitting every organ. The hormone can affect every single organ. It's fundamental. It's important for mood. It's important for growth, development, metabolism, various other things like sexual function. It's very, very important. Now, the endocrine system, being a signaling system, is controlled by the nervous system most of the time. There are certain cases where it's not controlled by the nervous system at all, but most of the time they work together. So the endocrine system is for slower processes, and the nervous system is more for fast, targeted processes. So endocrine is slow and whole body, like growth, and nervous is for fast and targeted. So like, moving your hand around is going to be a nerve signal, because your nerve can send a signal specifically to, that muscle and move it down, or this muscle and move it up, and stuff like that. That's the endocrine nervous systems. What is it? It's the hormones and the glands. We have to separate. We have to explain what a gland is. Here are various glands and parts of the endocrine system. A gland is anything that can release a chemical. So here's a gland, right? Produces and secretes chemicals. I'm going to move the thing over to the side here. Here's a few glands. So example, your salivary glands are a good example. They release saliva. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a hormone. It's just anything that can release a chemical. So your stomach has glands in it that are releasing HCl. Your airway has mucus glands that release mucus. Your sweat glands are releasing sweat. Hair glands make hair. Stuff like that. And therein lies a quick distinction between exocrine and endocrine. So exo means outside, and endo means inside, so exocrine is like sweat and saliva, so anything that releases stuff to the outside. Endocrine is anything that releases to the inside. Ooh, excuse me. Okay, we're going to get into hormones. I'm going to pause so that I can change this because we're into our next section, which is how do hormones send signals. We're on to this part right here. So I'm going to pause. Okay, we're back off pause. We're talking about how do hormones signal different cells and what's a hormone in general. So we're going to talk about this. Hormones are chemical messengers that send messages through the body. Typically, they go directly through the bloodstream to do it. And they're kind of classified according to activation site. Some hormones affect a lot of different places. So insulin, for example, insulin will induce almost any cell to pull in blood sugar to reduce the amount of sugar in the blood. Other hormones are specific. So, for example, you've got gastrin, which stimulates the stomach. You've got like thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid, things like that. How do they do it? The cell has to have a specific receptor for that hormone. So, for example, muscle cells have more receptors than bone cells, and they'll react to different hormones. And there's two different types. The two specific types are steroid hormones and protein hormones. Steroids are that class of lipids, this class of lipids with the ring structure for lipids. And the keep in mind here is that the cell membrane is made out of lipids. So the steroid hormone can actually go straight through the cell membrane. It can sneak itself right through the cell membrane, and it'll activate some kind of protein complex. And then that will move into the nucleus and will actually change how the DNA is read and how the DNA is synthesized. So this is kind of a cool, mashing of a couple of our units. We talked about biomolecules, the fact that steroids are a lipid and that the cell membrane is a lipid. We also talked about DNA synthesis and the regulation of DNA. So these guys can promote or what the opposite of promote is, which I've forgotten now. They can promote or inhibit transcription and translation by binding to specific proteins that work on DNA or RNA. So they tend to be longer lasting because they have gone across the cell. So maybe we'll do that as a keep in mind. Steroid hormones are longer lasting and take longer to take effect. Alright, steroid hormones are longer lasting and they take longer to take effect because they have to get through the membrane, get to this protein, get into the nucleus, and then start an actual DNA transcription, and then the DNA transcription takes a while. So before you see any changes, it takes a while. So steroid hormones will tend to be kind of those longer lasting, large distribution hormones. They also can enter any cell, so they're more likely to be those widely distributed hormones. So stuff like testosterone and estrogen and cortisol and stuff like that. That stuff. The other type is a protein hormone. Protein hormone are the opposite, right? They are short acting, very quick, but they also don't stick around as long. So protein hormones require a specific receptor. So they also require this specific receptor to be present on the cell, so they can be a little bit more targeted than the steroid hormones, because the steroid hormones can just go into any cell. The protein hormones have to hit that specific target. And when they hit the target on the outside of the cell, this receptor protein will set off a reaction, a chain reaction of chemical messages inside this cell, and that can go off and activate enzymes that are already present. This is why it's faster. It's faster because the enzymes are already made. It's faster because they're already there. They're just waiting for this chemical signal from something like CAMP or other molecules like that, and they're ready to go, compared to steroid hormones, which will actually change how your DNA is read. So these guys are targeted and fast. These guys are wide-ranging and slow. So these guys, for example, insulin is a protein hormone. It wants to be a protein hormone because it wants to act relatively quickly to reduce the blood sugar, and it also wants to target specific cells, like in the liver. It wants to be able to activate more of those than it does in other places. Adrenaline is also an example of a protein hormone. It's a faster acting one to get your body ready to go, ready to fight. That's steroid versus protein hormones. We're going to get into major glands in a second, but first I wanted to find a quick YouTube video or a diagram of this protein hormone coupled reaction to show you. So I'm going to pause and we'll find that video. Okay, so I found a video. This is from 2 Minute Neuroscience from Neuroscientifically Challenged, and it's really showing you the transmitter hitting the receptor. That receptor hits on top. The transmitter hits on top, and then this G protein moves and starts activating other enzymes and making other signaling cascades. So that's the kind of example that we want to get into. I'm going to link this whole video down below. It's only 2 minutes long. Watch it. It's probably the most common method of cell signaling, and hormones can set this off. So yeah, that's that piece. Next, we're going to get into the major glands. So I'm going to fix this up and I'm going to pause. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of these major glands. We're not going to talk about all of them. Behind my face here it just says endocrine. There are 7 major glands: hypothalamus, pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenals, which are above the kidneys, the pineal body, which is kind of in the middle of the brain, and the reproductive glands, so the ovaries and the testes. We'll start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is actually a brain structure more than it's a gland, but it does produce a lot of hormones. So it actually creates some hormones that it sends down the pituitary to release in the blood. So this is brain, that's skull right there, that's bone, that's skull. And then this pituitary is sitting with a lot of blood flow around it. So the hypothalamus will tell the pituitary when to release things. So it's kind of like the control center for hormones. It's responsible particularly it's responsible for thermoregulation. The hypothalamus decides what your body temperature should be and whether to bring it up or down, and takes in signals from those thermoreceptors to let you know, to let your body know whether to warm up or cool down. The pituitary is, hanging out next to the hypothalamus, down here in the kind of the middle of the skull, near the sinuses, surrounded by blood flow. It's very, very small, but it is considered the most important part because it's like the master gland. It releases hormones, and those hormones can go and make other glands make other hormones. So, it's got 2 sides, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Anterior means towards the front, posterior means towards the back. Among the hormones it produces are, human growth hormone is one of the big anterior lobe ones. It's called somatotropin as well. Somatotrope means body grow hormone. You might have heard of this as HGH. It makes your bones and other body tissues grow, and it does some nutrient handling stuff, as in distributing it towards the bone and the body tissues to grow. HGH. Some people use this for doping. It's also given as a treatment to people that are too short for their stature. It can only be given before the end of puberty. So, if you're too short and you've already passed puberty, sorry. The posterior lobe, it is the back side of the pituitary. So the pituitary, the little pea-like thing, has 2 sides. The back side is where the hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus, but then they move to the pituitary. They get stored there and then get released under nerve signals from the hypothalamus. This way, the hypothalamus, which is inside the brain, can be away from the blood flow and be safer. The two ones here that I want you to know about is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. Antidiuretic kind of takes a little bit to explain. A diuretic is something that makes you pee. So caffeine, for example, is a notable diuretic. It makes you pee more. An antidiuretic stops you from having to pee more. So it means that it's slowing down how much you pee. And it promotes reabsorption of water in your kidneys, leaving the water in your blood instead of peeing it out. And then there's oxytocin. We already talked a bit about oxytocin during our feedback loop. Feedback loop lesson 4.1. It triggers the contractions of the uterus during labor. There's that positive feedback loop to make the contractions stronger and stronger and stronger until the baby's out. It also promotes bonding because there's a bunch of oxytocin around right when the baby comes out, so it's thought to promote bonding. It's also involved in breast milk release when women are lactating. So here's the posterior lobe. You can see the special nerve cells that send the antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, to the pituitary, which is connected to the blood. The next set are the adrenal glands. You might have heard of adrenaline. There's a picture of them here. I'm going to move my face. Here's the kidneys. The adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys. The kidneys process a lot of blood, so these glands are right next to something with major blood flow. You can see here, this is the blood flow to each kidney. Those veins and arteries carry a lot of blood, and so this can pump out a lot of hormone very quickly. There's two glands. There's an inner part and an outer part, the medulla and the cortex, and mainly it's about stress. There's the medulla, the inside part, the inner part, that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, two very related molecules. That's adrenaline and noradrenaline. That's the fight or flight. They promote an increase in blood sugar that increases heart rate, particularly the noradrenaline. Noradrenaline will increase heart rate. Adrenaline doesn't increase heart rate, interestingly enough. Increases breathing rate, cell metabolism, dilates your blood vessels. The adrenaline will dilate the blood vessels. The noradrenaline won't. So it's interesting. They have similar but slightly different mechanisms of action. And dilates the eyes as well. That's also an adrenaline thing. This is why they give adrenaline to people with respiratory distress, the EpiPen. It dilates the blood vessels everywhere, including in their lungs. It dilates the tubes in their lungs and they can breathe better. That's the medulla, the inside. This is your quick response. Adrenaline is your quick response. The cortex. The cortex is involved in the sex hormones, but also in creating these glucocorticoids, like cortisol. Cortisol is a long-term stress response. And it increases the amount of amino acids in the blood, and generally just kind of prepares your body for repair mechanisms. Cortisol is your long-term stress hormone. As you can imagine, it's a steroid. The oid part here is steroid. It's a longer lasting one compared to these guys, which are shorter term ones. So that's that. Here's the short term and long term. There's a link to the nervous system here. The short term stress response is a nerve signal sent directly to the adrenal medulla, right to the inside of the medulla. Here's the nerve fibers from the brain. So the short term stress response, the adrenaline response happens on top of your kidneys. So there's a quick nerve signal that goes right there, and out goes the adrenaline and noradrenaline, and it starts working right away. But for the long-term stress response, for the cortisol, you don't need it to activate super quickly. Your body's not going to waste energy sending a nerve signal when it can just send a hormone signal instead. So the hypothalamus sends a hormone to the anterior pituitary gland, releases this stuff called corticotropin, which goes to the adrenal cortex, and then that releases the corticoids. And one of the things that the cortisol does is it slows down the hypothalamus and pituitary and your other hormones. So your long-term stress response is to slowly kind of diminish your short-term stress responses and anxieties, which is interesting. But yeah, a cool difference between a short-term message and a long-term message there. And here's a picture of it, right? The short-term stress response is just a boom, straight through the spinal cord, right down to the medulla. The long-term one is to the hypothalamus, to the pituitary gland, through the blood, to the cortex, to the outside, and then it secretes into the blood. This also suppresses the immune system, so long-term stress response will make you more prone to getting sick. People that are stressed out get sick more often because of it. Because of reducing the inflammation that's associated with repairing stuff. So growth hormone, we mentioned it earlier, is about the anterior pituitary. It affects pretty much all the cells to make them grow faster. Makes protein synthesis faster. So people take this when they're bodybuilding. It's technically illegal, but it's very hard to detect. And as you age, you make less and less growth hormone, and so it's harder to repair after an injury the older you get. Makes the skeleton longer if the bone plates haven't fused yet, and promotes breakdown of fats. So people do this as a doping thing. It can be prescribed for people that have growth hormone issues, like pituitary issues, but it can't be prescribed as an aging drug because, as you age, you lose the ability to repair stuff. Potentially, this might help people age better. Yeah. Okay, we're into the next section, which is our sugar hormones and diabetes. So I'm going to pause. All right, let's talk about sugar and sugar homeostasis. So that's our next piece, second last piece here. This is the pancreas. The pancreas sits next to the liver and right next to the small intestine, the duodenum of the small intestine. In the intestinal sense, it creates a lot of digestive hormones or digestive enzymes and puts them right into the duodenum to digest fats and sugars and proteins in the intestine. But it's also got a blood connection, and it's constantly monitoring the blood for blood sugar. Those cells are called the beta and alpha cells. They're in these islets of Langerhans. And they release insulin and glucagon. The beta cells release insulin, the alpha cells release glucagon. Now keep in mind here, insulin and glucagon are both protein hormones. Insulin has 51 amino acids. It's actually two chains that are kind of next to each other. One chain has 30 and the other chain has 21, but it's 51 amino acids together. And glucagon has 29 amino acids. So they're short proteins, but they are proteins. It makes sense that they're protein hormones. They want to be targeted and they want to be relatively fast acting. There's actually a picture of the islets of Langerhans behind my head, so I'll move it over to here. There you go. There's a little picture of the islets of Langerhans and the blood vessels coming through. Right, that's the beta cells. This is the other part of the pancreas with the bile duct, and that's going to go out to the duodenum. That's not the part that's actually making the alpha and beta, the insulin and the glucagon. It's this part that's doing it. So back I go to the right, and we're moving this way. So insulin. Insulin is the protein that decreases blood sugar. It's the hormone that decreases blood sugar, made in the beta cells. It's released when blood sugar increases. That's actually detected in those same beta cells that are going to release the insulin. So the receptor and the control center are the same place. It's the same cell. The cell has a way to monitor the blood and then release insulin. What it does is it makes the muscles and the liver take blood sugar in and store it as glucagon, as glycogen. Takes in the glucose and stores it as glycogen. Particularly muscles and liver, because they have a lot of storage for glycogen, but other cells will do it too. The liver, if it gets enough glycogen, will turn it into fat to store it permanently. The opposite one is glucagon, created by the alpha cells, and it's the same thing as the beta cells. The alpha cells contain the sensors, and they're checking the blood as well. So they are also both the receptor and the control center for this system. And that gets released when blood sugar levels are low, and it basically has the opposite function. So it turns the glycogen back into glucose, and it's released back in the blood, particularly in the liver. The glucagon affects the liver more than it affects the rest of the body. So that's the liver. The liver is very, very big and is constantly kind of trading glucose for glycogen and for fat and stuff, so it's doing a lot of work, a lot of energy. And this makes insulin and glucagon something that we consider complementary hormones that offset each other. One released and the other one released. So this is kind of a loop of the two. Notice that there's insulin on top and glucagon on the other, so one way and the other way. So beta cells do the insulin thing. It makes it promotes glucose storage in the liver and the body cells. Glucagon, if it's too low, the liver will release it, but the body cells don't. The body cells hang on to it. They're going to use it eventually anyway. You might have heard of insulin in relation to diabetes. So here's diabetes. If you are thirsty all the time and you have to pee a lot, and if there's high glucose in the urine, those are the symptoms. Typically there's low energy because you don't have glucose, and sometimes weight loss because there's not a lot of sugar. So there's fat being used for energy in that beta oxidation process. One of those symptoms includes acetone on the breath, which comes from that beta oxidation. I'm just going to pause for a sec. Sorry, back. Had to take care of something. It's just an interesting story. Is before they had blood sugar tests, they would test for diabetes with checking for glucose in the urine, and before they had even that, they would check by just tasting the pee and seeing if it tasted sweet. There was a whole industry of or a whole set of tests you could do with the smell and the color of pee and even the taste of pee to figure out what kind of diseases might be affecting somebody. So there were kind of like pee tasting experts. It was an interesting time in medical history. There's two types of diabetes. You might have heard of the two types, type 1 and type 2. The first type, type 1, used to be called juvenile diabetes because kids didn't tend to get type 2. Type 1 is typically genetic. It's some kind of issue with making insulin. Maybe the beta cells don't form properly, or the code for insulin is bad. Or later your pancreas takes damage and you just can't make insulin. That's the one that you have to inject yourself with. So they have to check their blood sugar and inject the insulin. It's an interesting one. They have some very interesting tech for that now, including auto injectors, so insulin pumps, which takes on the role of the pancreas. It's checking the blood for blood sugar constantly and injects insulin when it feels like it needs to reduce the blood sugar. So it's like having an artificial set of beta cells attached to your bloodstream, which is really cool. Type 2 is your pancreas can make insulin no problem, but your cells stop getting the signal. Remember that they need to get the signal. If we jump back through here to the protein hormones, because these are protein hormones, the receptors have to be there to get the signal, and your cells can actually change how many receptors they have. If they're getting too stimulated, they'll reduce the amount of receptors. So in type 2 diabetes, the cells become resistant to the insulin, and you can actually force them to become sensitive to insulin again with diet and exercise to reduce the amount of stimulation they're getting. You can also get some medication that helps with that too. Yeah. Excuse me. This was figured out famously by Frederick Banting. He's a Canadian. He kind of removed the pancreas from some dogs, and those dogs became diabetic. And there were other dogs where he collected the insulin. He harvested the insulin from those dogs. And he injected that insulin into the diabetic dogs that were like basically comatose because their bodies had too much blood sugar. And the dogs came back to life magically, except they had no pancreas now, so they had to be on insulin shots for the rest of their life. They got the Nobel Prize, Banting and McLeod, but Best did a lot of the work too, and he ended up not getting the prize, although Banting and McLeod did donate some of their winnings to him. Yeah. Next up is our last section, which is reproductive hormones and how birth control works. So I'm going to pause and set that up. Okay, so our last section here is the reproductive system. We have kind of separate male and female reproductive systems. Males have testes, they produce the male sex cells, the gametes called sperm. Females, they have ovaries, they make the ova, the eggs. They're different. And they produce reproductive hormones. Males, the main one is testosterone, the androgen. Testosterone, as you might imagine, is a steroid because it affects the whole body and has a long-lasting effect. So testosterone does all of that male characteristic stuff, like the deep voice, the higher height, the more muscle mass, the extra facial hair. It also affects the nervous system, so the hormones are actually affecting the nervous system. And the amount of testosterone at any given time actually induces, the sex drive. And this is something to point out. Women also make testosterone, and testosterone does also affect the female sex drive. And men do also make estrogen. These hormones aren't exclusive to males and females. In fact, testosterone is needed for certain growth and development of female body parts, and estrogen is also needed for growth and development of similar structures in men. It's the relative levels that decide during puberty whether you end up with the male or female archetype, basically. Females, a little bit more complicated with the hormones because of the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is a hormonal change. The eggs are held in the ovary and then released monthly. Well, not exactly monthly, it's every 28 days on average. And the uterus changes the thickness of the uterine wall to become ready for the implantation of a zygote. It follows through in these 4 stages: the menstrual phase, the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and the luteal phase. The menstrual phase is typically seen as the start because it flushes everything out and you have new tissue in the uterus. That tissue thickens and gets ready for the release of an egg into it from what are called the follicular cells. The eggs are stored in a slightly incomplete, they're almost ready, but they're just a little bit incomplete form. So during the follicular phase, the eggs finish their development and end up being ready for ovulation. Ovulation actually brings the egg down out of the follicle, and the egg is then ready. If that doesn't, and so egg is ready, then the luteal phase, the wall gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and if there's no implantation, then you end up with a menstrual phase and you start over again. But all of that is managed by levels of 4 different hormones. And these hormones are influenced by, say, body temperature, and they influence body temperature, they influence the thickness of the uterine wall. And here are the 4 hormones. The 4 hormones are luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, estradiol, aka estrogen, and progesterone. So you see them here on this chart. And here's the body temperature. You see the body temperature go up a little bit during ovulation and then come back down. I'll put my face in the bottom corner here. It goes up and then comes back down. So sometimes women, when they're looking to become pregnant, they're actually going to track their body temperature to see if it changes. And then this sudden change in body temperature lets them know that they're ovulating. Yeah, so here's the growing follicle. When it's ready to ovulate, there's a spike in follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that releases that prompts the release of the egg, that prompts the actual ovulation. And then they very quickly drop down to low levels. And part of that is due to the effects of progesterone here. When the progesterone is high, it reduces the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So when progesterone is high, it reduces that. This little spike over here will actually prompt the growing of a new follicle. This little spike over here. And then it repeats. This is actually the repeat. This part is the same as this part here. But if the progesterone stays high, which it does during pregnancy, then this little spike will never happen, and this follicle will never start growing a new egg, and it won't ovulate. So the idea behind the birth control pill is it releases progesterone and estradiol and keeps them artificially high. And because those are high, they inhibit the luteinizing follicle stimulating hormone. And you never ovulate another egg. And so it just, the eggs never come out. And if they were still high, then the menstruation part wouldn't happen. The drop in progesterone and estrogen stimulates the menstruation cycle. And this is why there's a week of placebo pills. I'm just going to stick my thing back in the corner. That's why there's a week of placebo pills in birth control. That drops these hormone levels to induce menstruation. And you won't have ovulation during menstruation. So after that week is over, you bring the progesterone back up before this spike can happen and release the egg. And so you never end up releasing an egg. That's the idea. The reason that they increase a hormone instead of reducing these hormones is, number one, it's hard to reduce, specifically target and reduce a hormone. It's much easier to increase a hormone just by adding an artificial version of it. Yeah, and number two, it's just safer that way. It's the first way they figured out, and it's got lots of research behind it. So that's it. That's our lesson for the day. We talked about what the endocrine system is and what it does, and why we have 2 separate ways to send signals to ourselves. The nervous system for quick and targeted, but it's high energy, and the endocrine system for system-wide messages that don't have to be very fast. So it's more energy efficient. We talked about steroid hormones versus protein hormones, where the steroid hormones can get into any cell because they go right through the cell membrane, and they'll actually directly affect DNA transcription. So they have longer effects, but it takes a while for that to start. Versus protein hormones, which hit these receptors and very quickly set off a signaling cascade and activate enzymes that are already made, so they can have a much faster effect, like insulin and glucagon. We talked about some different glands and hormones. We spent a lot of time talking about the pituitary and the hypothalamus and the way that they interact with each other. And we also talked about the adrenal glands and how there's 2 different systems for the stress response, which is over here. You've got the fast stress response, which is a direct nerve signal right to the medulla, which releases adrenaline and noradrenaline, and then the slower response, which goes through a hormone through the blood and releases cortisol, the long-term stress hormone. Then we talked about insulin and glucagon and this, opposing hormone thing that they have, the complementary hormone nature of insulin and glucagon and where they're detected and where they affect. So detected and released by the pancreas, but primarily have an effect in the liver. The liver is mostly the organ that pulls glucose in and releases glucose back out. And then the last thing we talked about was reproductive hormones in men and women, and how specifically hormonal birth control works, because it's a really good example of us artificially using hormone levels to control a small part of human biology. That's it for this week, that's it for this lesson. Thank you, and I'll see you guys in class on Monday. Thanks for paying attention. Bye.